Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending the Cruz Boulevard and Mill Boulevard Bicycle Improvements Project community meeting. This is the first meeting for second community meeting for this project after the webinar kickoff earlier in November. And then tomorrow night will also be the presentation for Scott Boulevard. You're welcome to attend both in person or virtually as well. Before we dive into the presentation, I'd like to hand it to Ralph Garcia of the city of Santa Clara to give some introductions.
Thank you, Regina. Yeah, so as mentioned, tonight we're going to focus on the De La Cruz and Lickmill Boulevard corridors. Tomorrow, if you're interested, at 6:30 p.m. in person or at the City Council chambers, or online via Zoom, we'll have the meeting for Scott Boulevard. Let me do some introductions. My name is Ralph Garcia. I'm a senior civil engineer with the City of Santa Clara and project manager for this project. Tonight, we also have Steve Chan, transportation manager here. Also on the project are Mike Liu, assistant public works director, and Nicole He, associate engineer. And we also have some of our consultants here tonight. From Kimley Horn, we have Adam Dankberg, Zachary Escobar, and from Circle Point, you've already met her, Regina Merrill. So I'm going to hand it back to Regina to go over some of the meeting logistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Yes, my name is Regina Merrill. We are with Circle Point, and we're helping with community outreach for this project, and I'll help be facilitating tonight's meeting. So for those of you joining online, you can change your name if you would like to rename yourself on the participants tab. If you'd like to join with your first name and adding your last initial as well. For the Q&A portion, we will have this at the end of the presentation. So for everyone in the room and online virtually, we'll save questions for a dedicated Q&A period at the end. But for those of you online, feel free to start putting any questions you may have in the Q&A. So they'll be queued up for us at the end of the presentation. So the buttons to do so are shown on the screen. And we'll be answering those live during the meeting this evening. If you are joining online and you would also like to ask your question out loud, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. If you're calling in, press *9 to request to be unmuted to ask your question, and we'll help facilitate that as well. And then those are our Zoom ground rules. And then I will hand it to Adam Dankberg for the agenda for tonight.
All right, thank you all for coming. I'm Adam Dankberg with Kimley Horn, the project manager for the consultant team on this project. So tonight we'll be focusing on De La Cruz and Lickmill. So I'll start by providing some background on the project, and we'll talk about those corridors in depth, and then we'll get to your questions at the end. So in terms of the project purpose and process, this project came about because the city was allocated about $2.7 million in federal earmarks for the project, and that $2.7 million in combination with the city's matching funds needs to fund the study that we're doing now, the design of the project, as well as construction of the project. So it's a fairly tight budget for these sort of things because we are looking at 3 different corridors. But it is great to have this federal money to be able to make improvements on these corridors. So the grant does have some schedule timelines for it. So the environmental clearance and product design needs to be done in September of this coming year. So that's pretty quick. And then construction needs to be done by September of 2030. So a little more time for that, but definitely a quick moving project to get through the design phase. As Ralph has mentioned, the focus is on 3 corridors. We're here tonight to talk about De La Cruz and Lickmill. So that's a segment of De La Cruz from Montague to Trimble, Lickmill from Tasman to Montague. We have another meeting tomorrow night to talk about Scott. So certainly encourage anybody who's interested in Scott Boulevard and attending that meeting tomorrow night. The project came about originally from initial planning that was done by the bike plan in 2018, the city's adopted bike plan. And so the goal of the project is to implement the recommendations that came out of the bike plan. So for De La Cruz, that is class 2 bike lanes, that's striped bike lanes on the roadway north of Montague Park. So from basically from Montague to Montague Park, and then class 4 separated bikeways. So that's the bike lanes are separated by some sort of vertical item, a bollard or a post, and that would be south of the park would be a class 4 separated bikeway. For Lickmill, The idea is to have a class 4 separated bikeway that will extend between Tasman and Montague. And that again is from the bike lane. For Scott, it's class 2B, which means there's a little striped buffer area between the bike lane and the travel lane, north of Monroe, and then class 2 bike lanes south of Monroe to the southern terminus, which is pretty close to the city boundary. So this project has about 4 phases, and we're currently in the second phase. So the initial effort was to collect data and develop the initial alternatives. We had a community meeting last month where we presented some of those initial alternatives. We are in the process of evaluating the alternatives, and we're looking for community input to assist with that evaluation. Once we get all that community input and the technical analysis, then it will be up to the city council to select a preferred alternative. So that process will include going to the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee next month and to the city council in February. Once the city has selected a preferred alternative, then comes the environmental clearance and final design. So we do want to emphasize that no alternatives have been selected or chosen at this point in time. We've identified some alternatives, and we're looking for community input to decide the next steps and really inform the council to make that decision. The overall project schedule, it is a quick one because of the terms of the grant. So we had initial BPAC meeting back in the summer, second BPAC meeting in August, and then the third BPAC meeting just about a month and a half ago or so. Those were to review the initial alternatives and advance those. Since then, we've been developing, we've conducted the data collection and continued to develop the alternatives and had that first round of outreach. We've done some evaluation work, which we'll present here tonight. And then we're preparing to go to BPAC again next month, and then the city council the month following. So the goal is by February that a preferred alternative is selected and design commences. So in terms of how bike lanes can be added, basically you need space, obviously, in the roadway in order to add in bike lanes and have the space you need to dedicate space for cyclists. This project has a fairly tight budget, and we also are cognizant of all the land uses and houses and businesses along these corridors. So we are not proposing any changes to the sidewalk or to properties to take any right away or anything like that along these corridors. So all the improvements will be done within the existing paved area of the roadways. So there's a few different options for how we actually go about reallocating the space for bike lanes. One is some of the lanes are really wide, so we can just narrow the lanes, still meet all the standards, and actually get the bike lanes in that way. In some locations, but in most locations, the lanes aren't that wide. They're maybe a little wide, but not that wide where we can just repaint them. So in most locations, we have to either remove parking or remove a travel lane. So we'll talk through about all those different alternatives tonight. One thing we did want to highlight is while the main focus of the project is on adding the bike lanes, there are a lot of safety benefits that go along with that. By narrowing travel lanes or reducing crossing distances, we are able to calm traffic, reduce speeds for vehicles, and reduce conflicts between cars and bicycles and pedestrians. So there are safety benefits associated with doing this project. And one thing I also want to highlight is because the project budget is limited to what it is in the earmark, the focus is really on striping improvements and bollards and post improvements. There aren't going to be opportunities for a lot of concrete work to add in protected intersections or modify signals, things like that. We're really focused on what we can do within the budget available to add these facilities. So as I had mentioned, one of the key aspects to inform the selection of the preferred alternative is to evaluate the effect of the different concepts that we've developed so far. And so we have several different evaluation tools that we have implemented and have information to share with you tonight to reflect that evaluation. So one is collision analysis. So we've looked at where collisions have occurred in the past on these roadways, and that really informs where some of the safety challenges exist and can be addressed by this project. Second is to look at parking, particularly in locations where parking is possibility to be removed in order to fit in the bike lanes. We've looked at where parking has been utilized. And we did counts in September 2024 across several days, looking at weekdays and weekends, looking throughout the day, late at night, to identify what the parking utilization is, basically the number of cars that are parked out there today. And that'll help inform basically the information that we'll present tonight in terms of some of the potential impacts to parked vehicles if we do reallocate the parking lanes. And then finally, traffic analysis. So we have vehicle counts that were conducted earlier this year. And we, particularly for alternatives where we're taking a travel lane in order to put in the bike lanes, we've looked at the effects on traffic circulation, delay, congestion by making that shift. So again, it's not necessarily that all the bike lane projects will remove all the parking and remove all the travel lanes. We're really just focused on alternatives of, can we narrow lanes? Can we remove parking? What are the effects of removing parking? What are the effects of removing a travel lane? Presenting that information and then looking for the community to provide that feedback on those trade-offs. And so with that, I'll back up here.
I am Zach Escobar with Kinley Horn, and so I'm going to talk about some of the analysis pieces and then some of the proposed concepts and alternatives that we have for these two corridors. So we're going to start with the collision analysis. So we have a graphic up here on the left side showing where the collisions are taking place on the corridor. We analyzed data from 2018 to 2023. And on that graphic, you can see with the larger circles where the highest number of collisions are occurring at the specific intersections. And then the collisions are also color-coded to show whether they were auto-only collisions, collisions that involved a bicycle, or collisions that involved pedestrians. And so what we see corridor-wide here for De La Cruz is that there were 68 total collisions over this 6-year period, 2 of which involved a bike and 2 of which involved a pedestrian. We also have a table here showing the level of severity or the level of injury that were involved in these specific collisions. And so what we see is that for the 4 collisions that involved both or either a bike or a pedestrian, there was some level of injury that was seen, whether it was a severe injury or another visible injury. And then for Lignot Boulevard, we also have a similar graphic showing where the collisions were occurring. You can see that there are larger circles at some of the more significant intersections like Montague Expressway in the south, or Tasman Drive or Hope Drive in the north. Corridor-wide here, we saw 47 total collisions on Lignot Boulevard, 2 of which involved a bike, and there were 0 pedestrian collisions. We also have a similar table showing the level of severity or injury that were involved for each one of these collisions. And we also see that for the 2 bike collisions on this corridor, it was also a level of injury, whether it was some kind of visible injury or a complaint of pain. So that is the collision analysis for De La Cruz and Lignot. We can now look at each one of the corridors and see what the proposed alternatives are. And so for each one of these corridors, we actually split up into different segments based on what the bike plan called for, based on what the existing travel lane configuration are, if there is on-street parking, and then also the land use. So for the first segment of De La Cruz, from Montague Expressway down to the south side of Montague Park, the goal for the 2018 bike plan is to provide Class 2 bike lanes. And the need here to create those bike facilities is going to come from either the removal of a travel lane or on-street parking on one side of the street. And so here for that first segment, we are going to have the existing conditions as that top image, that top cross section. So in today's condition, we see that there are 4 travel lanes, 2 going in either direction, and on-street parking on both sides of the street. So the first proposed concept, concept A, is going to be to remove a travel lane. So now we have 1 travel lane going in either direction, and then a center turn lane in the middle. And that's going to create room for those buffered bike lanes that we see there in that second graphic. And so those are going to be buffered with a painted median. And that concept maintains parking on both sides of the street. For concept B, we're maintaining the travel lanes going in either direction. So we keep those 2 going both ways. There's going to be the option to remove parking on the southbound side of the street to make room for the painted median bike lanes there. And so one thing that I want to note here is that we're going to have many slides like this where we're walking through each of the proposed alternatives for each one of the segments on these corridors. And it's not up to you to have to remember what each one of these is. One of the main vehicles that we're going to be taking in public input in addition to this community meeting is the online survey. And so we're going to talk about that more at the end, but the online survey is going to allow you to go at your own pace and look at each one of these segments and decide what you think should be the preferred alternative for these various segments, these various areas. But with that, we'll continue forward. So for the second segment of De La Cruz Boulevard, that's going to be from the south side of Montague Park down to West Trimble Road. And so for this area, the goal is going to be to provide class 4 separated bike facilities. And to be able to do that, we're going to need to remove either a travel lane or on-street parking on one or both sides of the street. And so the existing condition here is going to look very similar to what was previously shown. The difference here is that it's just going to be industrial land use on either side. But concept A and concept B are also going to look very familiar. So that first concept is also going to have those painted median buffered bike lanes by removing one of the travel lanes. Concept B is going to remove parking, but in this case on the northbound side of the street to make room for those buffered bike lanes. And now looking at concept C and D, this segment of De La Cruz is going to have 4 different options. And for C and D, it's going to be able to create space for those separated bike lanes that have that vertical delineator, those plastic bollards that we see here. So for concept C, there's also going to be the option to remove a travel lane. So here, again, we see one travel lane in either direction. We see the center turn lane. And then in this instance where we have the separated bike lanes, we also have the parking floating in between the vehicular traffic and the bike lanes. So here there's an option for the bike lanes to be up against the curb. For concept D, we are keeping the travel lanes in all directions, but to make space for those separated bike lanes instead of the painted median buffered bike lanes, there's going to be a need to remove parking on both sides of the street to make room for those class 4 facilities. So those are the 4 concepts for De La Cruz, segment 2. And so we've kind of looked at what those different concepts are. This is what the actual change is to the corridor. So a lot of information here. We're going to look through it left to right. So in the existing condition, we have a graphic showing all of those teal segments along De La Cruz. So that's showing where on-street parking is allowed today. And then those darker blue arrows represent where travel lanes can go either northbound or southbound. And we see that that's 2 in either direction for the existing conditions. Moving one graphic over to the right, this is now looking at travel lane removal. So we see that those teal segments along De La Cruz Boulevard and the side streets are all remaining the same, parking's remaining consistent. But those dark blue arrows, some of those have now turned to light blue, and that represents the removal of a travel lane. And then this also has those yellow turn lanes showing that center turn lane for these concept alternatives. And then those green dashed arrows represent where we're now adding in and having space for those bike lanes. It's going to be lighter green for those class 2 facilities that are the painted median buffer, and then darker green where we're proposing that separated plastic bollard bike facility. Going one more to the right, now we're looking at parking lane removal on one side of the corridor, and that's represented with that dashed red line there. So we can see that those dark blue arrows match what's in existing. So if we're removing parking to make space for the bike facilities, we can keep the travel lanes in both directions. And then you can also see the dashed green arrows representing that we have space there for the new bike lanes. And then there's also the potential for removing parking lanes on both sides of the street, specifically for the second or southern segment of De La Cruz. So you can see the dashed red line on both sides of De La Cruz on the southern portion. And then you can also see, compared to the graphic to the left, that these arrows are darker, signifying that if we remove parking from both sides of the street, that's going to be making space for those separated plastic bollard bike lanes. And again, I want to emphasize that on the online survey, you can take your time and kind of look at each one of these concepts one by one. And so understanding what the different changes are to the corridor, we can now look at the different analysis findings. So starting with the traffic analysis, looking at a travel lane reduction, we have a graphic here to the right that shows what each one of these study intersections was. So there were 9 here on De La Cruz, some of which were signalized and some of which were smaller side streets that are stop control. And so what we saw is that in the existing conditions today on De La Cruz, all of the intersections besides Laurelwood at De La Cruz operate within the city's level of service standard. Laurelwood today operates below the city's level of service standard, but what we saw was that with the removal of a travel lane, there was no significant impact to what was seen at that Laurelwood and De La Cruz intersection. So today it operates below the level of service standard, but with the project, it's not going to operate much worse than it is in today's condition. Outside of Laurelwood, the traffic analysis that we performed showed that there was going to be an increase somewhere between 0 and 3 seconds of delay per intersection along the corridor. So still showing pretty minimal impacts at each one of these intersections, at least what we expect based on the traffic analysis. So in addition to the traffic analysis, we also looked at parking. And so looking at the existing or just no parking removal situation today on De La Cruz, we have a graphic here on the left that shows the utilization or how used each one of these parking segments are along the street. And so the darker the blue that we see here in this graphic, the more utilized we are seeing those segments to be. And so for this graphic here, we are specifically looking at the daytime period on a weekday. And so what we saw was that the peak occupancy hour here for the weekday daytime period was from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. So that's kind of what we're showing here, maybe like the limiting factor in the graphic. So we also have a table showing what the parking inventory is, how many spaces are available to park on the northern segment, the southern segment, and then the side streets. And then what the utilization that we saw was during the weekday daytime period, and then also during the weekday nighttime period. And something that we want to note here for the nighttime period on the southern segment, that's showing 0% because when we did the parking counts, we did not see any cars parked on the southern segment, most likely because the nighttime period, this is an industrial area, and there's not going to be as much nighttime parking as the residential area to the north. So this is the existing condition. This is the existing utilization that we're seeing today. So we also did an analysis to understand what parking may look like if we remove on-street parking on De La Cruz from one side of the street. And so kind of the thought process here was that any of the cars that are going to be currently parked on those on-street segments would need to relocate to the nearest side street. And we tried to keep any of those relocations within 500 feet of where they're currently parked today. And so as we can see in this graphic here, the dotted red line shows where the parking removal is on one side of the street. And we can also see that some of the side streets here look a little bit darker than in the previous graphic, is that showing where some of those relocated cars are expected to go. And then we also have a table here signifying the different parking utilization for the north and south side of the corridor, and then for the side streets. And so for the northern side of the corridor, from Montague Expressway down to Montague Park, we expect about 17 cars to need to be relocated to the nearest side street. And then for that second segment, south of Montague Park, we expect 5 cars to need to get relocated to the nearest side street. So corridor wide, that's about 22 cars that are being affected. And one of the good things that we're seeing here is that all 22 of those cars are able to find somewhere close, a nearby side street to be able to park. And then also the little bubbles here on the graphic are also representing some of the side street parking segments that are at capacity. So somewhere between 91 and 100%. So with the relocations, there are some side segments that are showing this full capacity that we expect to be pretty much fully blocked, fully parked in this condition. And then we can also look at the alternative of removing parking on both sides of the street for that southern segment. As we can see in the graphic, the northern side is all grayed out. That's because removing parking is only a proposed alternative for that southern segment in the industrial area. So here, what we saw in the previous slide was that 5 cars were needing to be relocated with the removal of one side of the street. Removing parking on both sides of the street of De La Cruz here is going to, we expect to have to relocate 26 cars. So now instead of 22 corridor wide, that's 43. But again, what we're seeing is that the side street capacity on the nearest side streets are able to have space for the cars that were parked today on De La Cruz Boulevard in that southern segment. And with that, we are through De La Cruz. We're now going to talk about Lickmo Boulevard. So we're going to start with the proposed alternatives again. So for Lickmo, we also have two different segments. The first segment is from Tasman Drive down to the south side of Laird Circle. And then the second segment is going to be from Laird Circle down to Montague Expressway. And one of the main delineators here between these two segments is that the first segment has on-street parking today on both sides of the street, whereas the south side of Lickville has parking only on the southbound side. So the goal for this first segment is to provide Class 4 separated bikeways. And to be able to do that, there's going to be a need to remove either travel lanes or on-street parking. So there are three concepts for Lickmo Boulevard in this first segment. The existing condition has 2 travel lanes going in either direction, so 2 northbound, 2 southbound, and then parking on both sides of the street. You'll also notice that very large center median. So for the first concept, there's going to be the option to remove one of the travel lanes to make room for these painted median buffered bike lanes. So we see that there in concept A, there's now going to be 1 travel lane going in either direction, but on-street parking is maintained on both sides of the street. Concept B is going to have that Class 4 parking, that separated parking. It's going to have those plastic bollards. And that's also going to be with the removal of a travel lane. So concept B also has 1 travel lane moving in either direction. And then the parking here is going to be floating again. So it's going to be separating the vehicular traffic with the bike lanes. So concept B is going to have those bike lanes up against the curb line. Concept C is going to maintain all the travel lanes as they are in the existing condition today. But to do that and still have the separated bike lanes with those plastic bollards, there's going to be the need to remove parking on both sides of the street. So Lickmo Boulevard Segment 2, based on the 2018 bike plan, the goal here is also to provide Class 4 separated bikeways. And to be able to do that, there's going to be a need to remove travel lanes or on-street parking. So this is going to look very similar to what we had just seen on the first segment of Lickmo. The only difference is that in that existing condition, we don't have that on-street parking on the northbound side. And because of that, the options to make space for bike lanes going northbound is going to be pretty limited. So for concept A, B, and C, the only option is to remove a travel lane in the northbound direction to make space for that separated plastic bollard protected bike lane. And then going southbound, concept A, B, and C are going to match what we saw in segment 1. So I can walk through that quickly again. Concept A has the option to remove a travel lane to have buffered bike lanes. Concept B is also going to have the option to remove a travel lane to make space for a separated bike lane. And here the parking is going to separate the travel lane from the bike facility. And then concept C is going to keep both southbound lanes as they are in the existing condition to make space for that separated bike lane with the plastic bollard. So similarly to as we've seen before, we've now seen the concepts, and this is what the actual changes are. So in the existing condition, we can see in those teal segments where on-street parking is allowed today. The dark blue arrows indicate where travel lanes are. With the option of travel lane removal, we see that the teal segments remain the same as they are today. And then some of those dark blue arrows turn to light blue, signifying a removal of the travel lane. And then those green dotted arrows represent the addition of the bike lanes. And then only one option here for parking removal for Lickmo, and it's that is to remove parking on both sides of the street. And in that condition, the travel lanes are kept the same on that first segment, kept the same on the southbound portion of the second segment. And then again, since there is no parking to remove on the northbound side of that second segment, there's going to be the need to remove a travel lane to make space for bike lanes. We're going to walk through the traffic and parking analysis again. So for the traffic analysis on Lickville, looking at the reduction of a travel lane, we have a similar graphic showing the different intersections that we studied. On Lickville, we looked at 16 different intersections. And what we saw was that in today's existing condition, all but 3 of the intersections are operating within the city's standard for level of service. The 3 that are operating below are Tasman Drive, East River Parkway, and Fitzpatrick Way. And the only one of those that is a signalized intersection is Tasman Drive on the north side of the corridor. So what we were seeing was that the traffic analysis showed somewhere between 0 and 14 seconds of increased delay per intersection with the removal of a travel lane. And then the two areas that might experience some heavier delay, specifically in the AM peak hour periods, are those turning left off of Mansion Park Drive or those turning left off of East River Parkway. And the reason for that is even though that there is the reduction of a travel lane and people who are turning left off of these side streets no longer have to cross two streets to get to the other side of the road. There is going to be similar levels of traffic moving through a single lane, which makes it harder to find a gap in traffic. So in those two specific areas, only specifically for AM peak hour periods, there's an expectation that there may be an increase in delay. And now going to the parking analysis, looking at the existing conditions for Lick Mill, we have a similar graphic here showing the parking utilization. So again, the darker blue here represents where there is more parking or a higher utilization of parking. And then we have a table again showing what the parking inventory is, the number of spaces in that northern segment or southern segment, and then what we're seeing as the utilization for the weekday daytime and weekday nighttime period. And so this is the existing condition. With the project condition of potentially removing parking on both sides of the street, we have a graphic here representing that. So you can see that dashed red on both sides of Lick Mill Boulevard. And then you can see some of the darker blue on those side streets. So similar methodology here of wanting to relocate any of those cars that are going to be affected by the removal of parking on Lick Mill Boulevard and relocating to the nearest side street, ideally within 500 feet of where they're currently parking today. And so what we are seeing here is that parked cars that are able to relocate to a nearby side street in the northern segment, we expect to see about 16 cars. In the southern segment, we expect to see 22. Corridor wide, that's about 38 cars that we expect to be able to relocate to nearby side streets. We also expect at least one car to have to find parking across from where they're currently parked. And then we actually expect to see about 121 cars affected by this, but without somewhere on a nearby side street to park, at least within 500 feet of where they're currently parked today. So that's many of the cars that are currently today parking on Lick Mill Boulevard who do not have a nearby location to relocate to. But something that we want to note here is that this is showing the weekday daytime period. And so something that we actually see here in the daytime period on Lick Mill Boulevard is the northern segment closer to Tasman Drive has really high utilization that we expect is for temporary construction parking. So factoring that in, we actually believe that's going to be about 100 cars who hopefully not going to be impacted by this parking removal. And so that's something that's seen really well in the nighttime condition. So if I flip to the next slide, this is now weekday nighttime on Lick Mill, looking at the parking effects. So here we expect on the north side, 13 cars to be able to relocate to nearby side streets. On the southern portion of Lick Mill, that's 23 cars, so total of 36. We still expect at least one car to have to move across the street to find parking. And then now, instead of that 120 number of cars who do not have somewhere nearby to relocate to, it's now down to 36. So without that temporary construction parking that we expect to see, we expect somewhere around 36 cars to need to either find somewhere greater than 500 feet to park or somewhere off corridor. And then again, we have those blue bubbles here on the right side showing where the different parking segments are at peak capacity and where we expect those to be fully parked, fully full. And that is the parking analysis for Lick Mill. So I think Adam's going to come up and talk about next steps.
Thanks, Zach. Real quick, actually, in terms of next steps, we are looking for your input. We have a survey that's open now. Regina will talk about that in just a second. We'll be taking all this analysis and the input that we hear from the community to the BPAC that is scheduled for January 27th. next month, so put that on your calendars. And then city council February 25th. The month after, we're marking as tentative, but assuming that we're able to gather all the input and get direction from BPAC, the goal is to go to city council in February. Back to Regina.
Thank you, Adam. So next up, our next outreach activity, as previously mentioned, is the workshop tomorrow for Scott Boulevard. So it'll be a similar hybrid meeting format. Additional details in the Zoom information can be found online. And as we've been mentioning, the online survey is live. This will be open until midnight on December 22nd. So there's one survey for each corridor. So on the screen are the QR codes for De La Cruz Boulevard and Lick Mill Boulevard. There's also a separate one for Scott Boulevard. You're welcome to take all three, depending on which corridor you're most interested in. And again, that will remain live through December 22nd. So that's one of the many ways that you can provide your input on this project to date, and these surveys highlight what was shown in the presentation this evening. There's also additional ways to stay involved, so please do visit the project webpage for the most up-to-date information. That also has the links to the surveys. It will also have recordings of this meeting and summaries of these meetings and the Q&A process. You're also welcome to send us an email to the project email or leave us a voice message. We've been receiving many comments through the project email and voicemail already, so we also are taking feedback that way. We really want to encourage you to do what is ever easiest for you to share your input. And again, we'll be collecting survey input through December 22nd. So with that, we are also now going to move on to the Q&A portion of the evening. So a quick reminder for those online, please do use the Q&A function to ask your question. You're also welcome to raise your hand to ask your question out loud. We will be taking questions from the room live first, and then we'll move to the questions that are being asked online. So for everyone in the room, we'll be passing around the microphone to you if you have any questions to ask out loud. And then for folks joining online, we'll be queuing those up after people in the room have asked their questions as well. So with that, I will invite Adam and Ralph to help with the Q&A portion. And one more time, I'll leave this open for the survey link for anybody who is interested. But then feel free in the audience to raise your hands if you have any questions, and we'll come around to the microphone for you to ask your question.
Specifically speaking to the Licknell, the stretch of the pathway, given that the full width of Licknell is residential, it has 2 open spaces on it, it has a school on it. It's not a lane on the street that lends itself to reducing parking, is what I'm gonna say. Learned at the last meeting that the plans that were initially to extend Licknell out around the related project have been changed, and Licknell will continue to end at Tasman. Given that it's a street that's 1.5 miles long, I would, as a resident, I would lobby for reducing traffic rather than parking. You mentioned that construction parking is expected to decrease as the Tasman East project finishes up. Tasman East will have a high residential population. There's already a high residential population on the corner of Tasman and Licknell. So I think plans that will decrease substantially, maybe overly optimistic in terms of parking requirements along Licknell. That's what that was
Yeah.
Hi, Betsy Magus. I am a member of the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Speaking this evening for myself. A few questions on this one. You mentioned in passing the environmental clearance. I wonder what's going to be involved with that, and whether it changes depending on which of these options we select. If it gets more costly or time consuming, very difficult, depending on what we are doing. On the collision data, has anything changed since before 2018 about the roadways or how the collision data is being reported? And if not, why are we not also reporting all the collision data in a list? I'm really wondering how many collisions were at intersection versus how many were mid-block. So mid-block bike lane is helpful for keeping comfortable, but I think in general, most collisions happen at intersections. And they have, that's when the conflicts can occur. And that's when decisions have to be made. And also, you're talking a lot about level of service. What is the potential reduction here for the different options, perhaps, or in general, for reducing BMT? Assuming that we also connect the other corridors that have already been approved for bike lanes. Because, the way to reduce traffic congestion and vehicle miles traveled is not to worry about car throughput, but to provide usable alternatives to driving and to discourage driving in the first place. Those are my questions.
So I think we had three parts there, some related to data and then midway intersections and the last one relating to BMT.
So this is Ralph Garcia. So in terms of environmental, since this is mostly a striping project, all of our alternatives would have the same level of environmental review. So there wouldn't be a lot of changes with any of the options seen tonight. And I'll hand it over to Adam to talk about some of the analysis that we've done.
Yeah, there's a question on collision data going back in time. There's no magic in 2018. We just really look at the recent handful of years, just because we feel like that best reflects current driving patterns and geometry that's out there. So there isn't anything special about 2018. It's just sort of typical practice to look at the last 5 or 6 years. So that is the why 2018 data is shown. There's a question on BMT. We haven't done a BMT analysis for these particular alternatives at this point, but we have done similar analyses for other bikeway studies that you've seen recently, and they do show some potential for conversion of a lot of trips into bike trips with provision of these facilities. So don't have any data specific to these corridors yet, but there is likely a similar opportunity here. Is that it? Did I miss anything?
Intersections versus mid-block.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think, we have data for both intersections and mid-block. I mean, you're correct that most of the collisions happen at the intersections. I don't think we have that breakdown handy with us here tonight, but I mean, just from having looked at the data, it's predominantly at intersections where the collisions occur, especially involving cyclists and pedestrians. Yeah, feel free.
I would also
Zach.
I would also just say from like the analyst side of things that the geographic positioning of the collisions is also not perfect where those are being recorded. So a lot of times, if it's generally near an intersection, there will be like multiple overlapping collision points at the exact same point, and they probably didn't happen at the exact same point in space. So just kind of like aggregating by collisions is something that was we thought was going to be good practice.
We have a few, I'm sorry. Thank you, it's gonna go to you online.
I was just wondering, one of the reasons this project was created is because there is available funding from the federal government. Are there other projects that the money can be used? And that's my first question. Second question is about reducing traffic. If you reduce parking spaces for residents by removing those parking spaces. I'm concerned about Lake Mill. Lake Mill there's a school over there. And parents who come to pick up and drop off their kids need those parking spaces. But to remove those parking spaces, not just for the residents, but for those parents who come to pick and drop off their kids. It's not just during school days. There are some events that are held there, not just for during school days. So I'm really very concerned about that, being a resident of that area.
Both of them. And just perfect, both of them, as discussed tonight, that was up in elementary school, more or less in the middle.
Yeah, the first question of the city elaborate if needed, but the federal earmark is just specifically for these 3 corridors. So the limits and project definition is really set by the earmark, so the money can't be reallocated to other corridors. It's just for these, very specific. And then the second comment about the school, certainly that's something worth noting. We have been out there and noticed that activity as well. So I think that is certainly an argument that can be made about maybe picking one alternative over another is the potential of back to school pickup, drop off, and event access.
Okay, we're going to move to a few questions from the Q&A from people joining online. So first up, how do you factor in the traffic calming benefits of lane and or parking removal? I live right adjacent to the southbound lanes of Lake Mill near Laird. For a while, I would get woken up in the middle of the night daily by the vibration of a person speeding at 50 miles an hour.
Yeah, it's a good question, a good comment. I think in terms of the traffic calming benefits, the alternatives that do have the class 4 protected bike lanes generally would be expected to have potential for a greater benefit. A lot of times, drivers drive fast because it seems like they can drive fast. The road's wide and comfortable, and they don't have to worry about hitting anything, and there's a lot of space for them to use, particularly at off-peak hours when there's not a lot of other vehicles out there. So anytime that you narrow that perceived width of the roadway, and putting in bollards is one way to do that. Studies have shown over and over again that drivers do have a tendency to slow down. So I think really by reducing the number of travel lanes, you're likely to get some sort of speed reduction. But I think putting in those class 4 bikeway posts really has the greatest potential to be able to reduce speed. It's a little tough to quantify, but there are countless studies that show that kind of reducing that perceived width of the roadway does have benefits to reduce speed as well.
Thank you, Adam. Next question from online. Will there be any changes to the traffic signaling at Lick Mill / East River Parkway?
Yeah, that's a good question. And East River Parkway is the what we call pedestrian hybrid beacon, or Hawk is kind of its old name. It's the flashing lights. And basically the project is not proposing to change that operation at all. As I kind of hinted at earlier, the budget is really to focus on striping and post placement. There isn't an opportunity to do a new full traffic signal there at that location or anything. So there really is no plan to change the operations of that pedestrian hybrid beacon at East River Parkway. I will note that if we do remove a travel lane on Lake Mill, that's just less distance the pedestrians are going to have to cross where they're in conflict with vehicles. So there is a potential safety benefit for that crossing. But in terms of how the signal would actually operate, there would be no change as part of the project.
Thank you. Another question from online. How do you factor in pedestrian safety benefits of parking removal? Parked cars tend to obstruct pedestrians waiting to cross. For example, this was a huge problem at Lick Mill and East River Parkway until a whole flashing pop signal overhead was installed, a few pedestrian car collisions, and many afraid pedestrians.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Certainly, parked vehicles can have the potential to obstruct pedestrian visibility. I'll also note that the state recently passed a daylighting law that requires all parking to be removed 20 feet upstream of any crosswalk, so 20 feet approaching any crosswalk. parking is no longer allowed legally in the state. So I think that already is impacting or will impact some of the parking in the corridor and will help pedestrian visibility. But yeah, there's a potential benefit as well for pedestrian visibility by removing parking. So I think, there's certainly some benefits of traveling removal in terms of slowing vehicles down. I think there's also, and that has pedestrian safety benefits. There's also safety benefits, I think, of removing parking as well. So I think that's kind of one of the ideas is in general, this product has the potential to improve safety as sort of a byproduct of providing the bicycle lanes.
And then a follow-up question to that, did you factor in parking spaces at Northside Library and Rivermark Shopping Center and Live Oak Park, or is it out of range? Lots of parking spots that are often underutilized are there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We really just focused on street parking that exists today. So we were just looking at publicly owned on-street parking. So I think the commenters bringing up some of the private off-street lots nearby. I know there are some kind of use restrictions on those lots, so we didn't really dive into all of that. What we're showing here tonight is just looking at the on-street parking opportunities.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, we don't have any additional questions online at the moment, but for anyone joining online, John, I see your hand is raised. I'm going to allow you to come off mute and talk and ask your question out loud. You wanna unmute? John, go ahead. John, give us one moment if you're talking.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks so
Okay,
much.
thank you. So as a resident of the area, one of the concerns I have, and as was mentioned in the previous questions, was the issues of speeding. I think one of the other things I wanted to ask is, aside from just installing the class 4 bike lanes and bollards, has just a general lane narrowing been, in addition to these bike lanes, been considered? Because from the research that I've done and understanding the issues of traffic calming, is more narrow roads tend to slow cars. So that, in conjunction to the bike lane, would that also have been considered? And then another question I have is there a plan to, in the future, make much more permanent bollards? So instead of like plastic bollards, maybe like raised curbs? Because I know one of the things that usually comes up is, as a cyclist, because I myself have ridden my own bike up and down these corridors, Dela Cruz and Lick Mill, and I've had plenty of cars dip into the bike lane, as well as on the class 2 on Lick Mill, where cars have honked at me or tried to pass me aggressively. And so for the future, and would there be a consideration of those more permanent structures? Because it could make younger riders, like any kids, especially because there are going to be more people moving to due to the related developments. Would that be something more down the line? Is that too far? Am I grasping at something too far forward in the future? Just kind of am concerned because a lot of drivers not only speed, also don't mind hitting a plastic bollard because it's plastic. It's not going to hurt their car. And I know in other cities where there are more, or even other parts of the city, our city, there are those raised curbs to protect the cyclists. That is my question.
Take the first one and invite Ralph or Steve to handle the second one. So the first question was about lane widths, if there's an opportunity to also reduce lane widths as part of the project. And that is something that we are looking at. For Lick Mill, there are some 13-foot wide lanes out there today, which does certainly promote a faster driving speed. And so with the project, we would be reducing those down to general 11, 12 in some places where it's next to a raised curb to allow for that striped shy area. So yes, as part of this project, we would certainly be looking to essentially right size all the lane widths to get them consistent with best practices right now. So that's something that would be included as part of the project. You want to talk about the potential for permanent in the future?
Yeah, sure. Steve Chan, Transportation Manager. Regarding long-term improvement for Class 4 bike lane, more permanent concrete separator instead of the channelizer that we're proposing, that costs significantly more, obviously, because it's concrete. So right now at this time, we are trying to install as much Class 4 facility as possible out there in the city network. As funding opportunity becomes available, we'll definitely look for opportunity to further enhance the Class 4 bike facility to install concrete separator where possible to further enhance the bike facility in the city.
Thank you, Adam and Steve. John, let us know if you have any follow-up questions, either in the Q&A or by raising your hand again. Thanks so much. We have one more in the Q&A currently, two more. Is there a possibility to add a beg button on the other side of East River Parkway so that cyclists coming along East River and are heading into Tamian Park don't have to start by crossing East River on the wrong side in order to reach the beg button?
Yeah, so my understanding of the comment is the crosswalk's only on one side of the street. So if you're riding eastbound on East River, you kind of have to go to the crosswalk in the north leg to hit the button. So this project is not including any modifications to that. I certainly understand the request. It's a very logical one, but because the project is limited in budget and focus, that is not part of this project, but it's something we can certainly flag and note as a beneficial future improvement. But yeah, it's not something we can do at this time. Definitely a good comment request.
Thank you. Another question, will this impact pedestrian crosswalk length? I remember waiting to walk across the intersection of Lick Mill and Fitzpatrick, and 2 to 3 cars failed to stop for me on both southbound travel lanes.
Yeah, so I think one of the benefits if parking removal is the preferred alternative for any of these corridors, is that one of the biggest challenges for a pedestrian crossing the street in a 2-lane multi-lane roadway is maybe the first car stops for you, but the second car doesn't see you and doesn't stop, and kind of double threat concern. So if we do go from 2 lanes in one direction to 1 lane in each direction, that does really improve the pedestrian visibility. So you know, we aren't able to pay for new curb ramps that extend out, new bulb outs, and fancy, really expensive capital improvements here as part of this project. So the overall amount of striping that's out there is not going to change as part of this project. So the total crossing distance is basically the same. But in terms of the distance you have to cross where you're actually under threat from being hit by a vehicle, does get much shorter in any alternative that removes the traffic lane. And you can maybe even say removing a parking lane also improves, reduces that amount of threat. So I think there's some definitely safety benefits for crossing, and maybe in the future there's an opportunity to actually do bulb outs and really shorten that actual crossing distance. So it's kind of a half answer, I guess, in a way of it does reduce the threat to pedestrians. It does shorten the amount of distance you're actually potentially in conflict with the vehicle, but the actual striping distance is going to remain the same.
Thank you. Wanted to check in if there's any other questions or comments from folks joining us in the room as well. Happy to come back around with the mic. All right. Yeah.
This is just very general, but the question that John raised about the increased safety for more permanent structures, has there been anything to show that the alternative that has the bike lane between parked cars and the curb is any safer than between parked cars and traffic? I think they were seated.
Yeah. I mean, a class 4 bike facility, which is some sort of separation between vehicles and the cyclists, is going to be better for bicyclist safety. We can't do bollards where there's parking on the curb and the bike lane next to it because you have to be able to access the park. So we're basically limited to a class 2 bike lane or a buffered bike lane when the parking is along the curb. Where the bike lane's along the curb and the parking is floating, that's an opportunity to really protect that cyclist from vehicle traffic. One of the challenges.
That has played out in.
Yes, yeah, there's studies showing the benefits of the class 4. One of the challenges with that configuration is people parking in the right spot and actually following the markings. I think there's been plenty of case studies of that where that has been a challenge. So I think that's something sort of to be aware of, is that the floating parking isn't always successful because vehicles don't always abide by the rules. So that is something where, ultimately putting raised protection to actually not allow the cars to actually even get to the curb is really beneficial. But we would, this project is limited to the bollard. So there is some potential for vehicles not necessarily following the rules and actually ending up parking on the curb with the floating bike lanes.
Other questions from our live audience? Right here. All right. I'm also not seeing any additional questions in the Q&A online or hands raised. We're happy to give people a few more minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, we can go on to project next steps and go back to the slides about how to submit further comments and input. But one more. All right.
This is admittedly a tangent, but has there been any experience with, as lanes are redesignated, with attracting or discouraging homelessness, RV parking along the street? Hope Avenue, which was one of the cross streets at Lake Mill, does attract RVs right now, and usually it seems that streets that attract that, Agnew about a mile away also attracts some. They tend to be streets with wider parking available to them. And do any of the plans for redesignating lanes have that aspect to them, that they would affect the parking space, actually increase the width of the parking space, that would encourage parking of larger vehicles, either RVs or we see semis occasionally out there.
I guess to most kind of directly answer the specifics of the question, no, we aren't proposing to widen any parking lanes that exist. In some cases, parking would be removed, but in no cases would we be widening any parking lanes. Usually the RV or longer term parking situation is more of a policy thing, but in terms of the design, we wouldn't be doing anything that would with that.
Thank you for all these excellent questions and comments. Again, I'm not seeing any activity in the Q&A, so I think we're going to go back to our ways to stay involved slide. So for folks joining online, we'll be ending the online portion of this webinar shortly. But as a reminder, please feel free to go to the City of Santa Cruz project webpage. That is available at the QR code shown on the screen. You're also welcome to send us an email or leave us a voice message with your comments. And again, we hope you'll take the survey and submit your feedback online through Sunday, December 22nd. So with that, I'm going to close the online portion of the webinar, but folks in the room, welcome to stay and ask any additional questions as well. All right, thank you everyone joining us online. And Circle Point folks, if you can help end the webinar.